of Zen by Alan Watts. Part 2, Principles and Practice. Chapter 2, Sitting Quietly Doing Nothing. In both life and art, the cultures of the Far East appreciate nothing more highly than spontaneity or naturalness. This is the unmistakable tone of sincerity marking the action which is not studied and contrived. For a man rings like a cracked bell when he thinks and acts with a split mind, one part standing aside to interfere with the other, to control, to condemn, or to admire. But the mind, or the true nature, of man cannot actually be split. According to a Zen Rin poem, it is like a sword that cuts but cannot cut itself, like an eye that sees but cannot see itself. The illusion of the split comes from the mind's attempt to be both itself and its idea of itself, from a fatal confusion of fact with symbol. To make an end of the illusion, the mind must stop trying to act upon itself, upon its stream of experiences, from the standpoint of the idea of itself which we call the ego. This is expressed in another Zen Rin poem as sitting quietly doing nothing. Spring comes and the grass grows by itself. This, by itself, is the mind's and the world's natural way of action. As when the eyes see by themselves, and the ears hear by themselves, and the mouth opens by itself, without having to be forced apart by the fingers. As the Zen Rin poem says again, the blue mountains are of themselves blue mountains, the white clouds are of themselves white clouds. In its stress upon naturalness, Zen is obviously the inheritor of Taoism, and its view of spontaneous action as marvellous activity is precisely what the Taoists meant by the word te, or virtue, with an overtone of magical power. But neither in Taoism nor in Zen does it have anything to do with magic in the merely sensational sense of performing superhuman miracles. The magical or marvellous quality of spontaneous action is, on the contrary, that it is perfectly human, and yet shows no signs of being contrived. Such a quality is peculiarly subtle, another meaning of Mao, and extremely hard to put into words. The story is told of a Zen monk who wept upon hearing the death of a close relative. When one of his fellow students objected that it was most unseemly for a monk to show such personal attachment, he replied, "Don't be stupid. I'm weeping because I want to weep." The great Hokuin was deeply disturbed in his early study of Zen when he came across the story of the master Yen Tao, who was said to have screamed at the top of his voice when murdered by a robber. Yet this doubt was dissolved at the moment of his satori, and in Zen circles his own death is felt to have been especially admirable for its display of human emotion. On the other hand, the abbot Way of Zen and his monks allow themselves to be burned alive by the soldiers of Oda Nobunaga, sitting calmly in the posture of meditation. Such contradictory naturalness seems most mysterious, but perhaps the clue lies in the saying of Yun Men, in walking, just walk, in sitting, just sit, above all, don't wobble. For the essential quality of naturalness is the sincerity of the undivided mind, which does not differ between alternatives. So when Yen Tao screamed, it was such a scream that it was heard for miles around. But it would be quite wrong to suppose that this natural sincerity comes about by observing such a platitude as, "Whatsoever thy findeth to do, do it with all thy might." When Yen Tao screamed, he was not screaming in order to be natural, nor did he first make up his mind to scream and then implement the decision with the full energy of his will. There is a total contradiction in planned naturalness and intentional sincerity. That is to overlay, not to discover, the original mind. Thus, to try to be natural is an affectation. To try not to be natural is also an affectation. As a Zen Rin poem says, "You cannot get it by taking thought. You cannot seek it by not taking thought." But this absurdly complex and frustrating predicament arises from a simple and elementary mistake in the use of the mind. When this is understood, there is no paradox and no difficulty. Obviously, the mistake arises in the attempt to split the mind against itself. But to understand this clearly, we have to enter more deeply into the cybernetics of the mind, the basic pattern of its self-correcting action. It is, of course, part of the very genius of the human mind that it can, as it were, stand aside from life and reflect upon it, that it can be aware of its own existence, and that it can criticize its own processes. But the mind has something resembling a feedback system. This is a term used in communications engineering for one of the basic principles of automation, of enabling machines to control themselves. Feedback enables a machine to be informed of the effects of its own action in such a way as to be able to correct its action. Perhaps the most familiar example is the electrical thermostat, which regulates the heating of a house. By setting an upper and lower limit of desired temperature, a thermometer is so connected that it will switch the furnace on when the lower limit is reached, and off when the upper limit is reached. The temperature of the house is thus kept within the desired limits. The thermostat provides the furnace with a kind of sensitive organ, an extremely rudimentary analogy of human self-consciousness. The proper adjustment of a feedback system is always a complex mechanical problem. For the original machine, say, the furnace is adjusted by the feedback system, but this system in turn needs adjustment. Therefore, to make a mechanical system more and more automatic will require the use of a series of feedback systems. A second to correct the first, a third to correct the second, and so on. But there are obvious limits to such a series, for beyond a certain point, the mechanism will be frustrated by its own complexity. For example, it might take so long for the information to pass through the series of control systems that it would arrive at the original machine too late to be useful. Similarly, when human beings think too carefully and minutely about an action to be taken, they cannot make up their minds in time to act. In other words, one cannot correct one's means of self-correction indefinitely. There must soon be a source of information at the end of the line which is the final authority. Failure to trust its authority will make it impossible to act, and the system will be paralyzed. The system can be paralyzed in yet another way. Every feedback system needs a margin of lag or error. If we try to make a thermostat absolutely accurate, that is, if we bring the upper and lower limits of temperature very close together in an attempt to hold the temperature at a constant 70 degrees, the whole system will break down. For to the extent that the upper and lower limits coincide, the signals for switching off and switching on will coincide. If 70 degrees is both the lower and the upper limit, the go sign will also be the stop sign. Yes will imply no, and no will imply yes. Whereupon the mechanism will start trembling, going on and off, until it shakes itself to pieces. The system is too sensitive, and shows symptoms which are startlingly like human anxiety. For when a human being is so self-conscious, so controlled that he cannot let go of himself, he divers or wobbles between opposites. This is precisely what is meant in Zen by going round and round on the wheel of birth and death. For the Buddhist samsara is the prototype of all vicious circles. Now, human life consists primarily and originally in action, in living in the concrete world of suchness. But we have the power to control action by reflection, that is, by thinking, by comparing the actual world with memories or reflections. Memories are organized in terms of more or less abstract images, words, signs, simplified shapes, and other symbols which can be reviewed very rapidly one after another. From such memories, reflections, and symbols, the mind constructs its idea of itself. This corresponds to the thermostat. the source of information about its own past action by which the system corrects itself. The mind-body must, of course, trust that information in order to act, for paralysis will soon result from trying to remember whether we've remembered everything accurately. But to keep up the supply of information in the memory, the mind-body must continue to act on its own. It must not cling too closely to its own record. There must be a lag or distance between the source of information and the source of action. This does not mean the source of action must hesitate before it accepts the information. It means that it must not identify itself with the source of information. We saw that when the furnace responds too closely to the thermostat, it cannot go ahead without also trying to stop, or stop without also trying to go ahead. This is just what happens to the human being, to the mind, when the desire for certainty and security prompts identification between the mind and its own image of itself. It cannot let go of itself. It feels that it should not do what it is doing, and that it should do what it is not doing. It feels that it should not be what it is, and be what it isn't. Furthermore, the effort to remain always good or happy is like trying to hold the thermostat to a constant 70 degrees by making the lower limit the same as the upper. The identification of the mind with its own image is, therefore, paralyzing because the image is fixed. It is past and finished, but it is a fixed image of oneself in motion. To cling to this, it is thus to be in constant contradiction and conflict. Hence you men saying, in walking, just walk, in sitting, just sit, above all, don't wobble. In other words, the mind cannot act without giving up the impossible attempt to control itself beyond a certain point. It must let go of itself, both in the sense of trusting its own memory and reflection, and in the sense of acting spontaneously, on its own into the unknown. This is why Zen often seems to take the side of action as against reflection, and why it describes itself as no mind or no thought, and why the masters demonstrate Zen by giving instantaneous and unpremeditated answers to questions. When Yun Men was asked for the ultimate secret of Buddhism, he replied, "Dumpling," in the words of the Japanese master Takuin. When a monk asks, "What is the Buddha?" the master may raise his fist. When he is asked, "What is the ultimate idea of Buddhism?" he may exclaim, even before the questioner finishes his sentence, "A blossoming branch of the plum," or "the cypress tree in the courtyard." The point is that the answering mind does not stop anywhere, but responds straight away without giving any thought to the felicity of an answer. This is allowing the mind to act on its own. But reflection is also action, and Yun Men might also have said, in acting, just act, in thinking, just think. Above all, don't wobble. In other words, if one is going to reflect, just reflect, but do not reflect about reflecting. Yet Zen would agree that reflection about reflection is also action, provided that in doing it we do just that, and do not tend to drift off into the infinite regression of trying to always stand above or outside the level upon which we are acting. Thus, Zen is also a liberation from the dualism of thought and action, for it thinks as it acts, with the same quality of abandon, commitment, or faith. The attitude of Way of Zen is by no means an anti-intellectualist exclusion of thinking. Way of Zen is action on any level whatsoever, physical or psychic, without trying at the same moment to observe and check the action from outside. This attempt to act and think about the action simultaneously is precisely the identification of the mind with its idea of itself. It involves the same contradiction as the statement which states something about itself. This statement is false, for example. The same is true of the relationship between feeling and action. For feeling blocks action, and blocks itself as a form of action. gets caught in this same tendency to observe or feel itself indefinitely, as when, in the midst of enjoying myself, I examine myself to see if I'm getting the utmost out of the occasion. Not content with tasting the food, I'm also trying to taste my tongue. Not content with feeling happy, I want to feel myself feeling happy, so as to be sure not to miss anything. Whether trusting our memories or trusting the mind to act on its own, it comes to the same thing. Ultimately, we must act and think, live and die from a source beyond all our knowledge and control. But this source is ourselves, and when we see that, it no longer stands over against us as a threatening object. No amount of care and hesitancy, no amount of introspection and searching of our motives can make any ultimate difference to the fact that the mind is, like an eye that sees,